Thank you, Dr. Saideloff, and also thanks to the Selection Committee and the Voice Foundation for this honor. And I think now I'm supposed to give a presentation, if I understand correctly. Let's see if I can figure out where's the button to advance.
The red button to reverse.
So some financial disclosures. This work was supported by several grants over the years from NIDCD, and I do have a financial interest in a company called InnoVoice that I want to declare. I also want to acknowledge the current funding that we have is for a clinical research center to study hyperfunctional voice disorders. I can look down here, that's better. This involves 13 institutions, some of them international, and 19 key personnel. And if you're interested, there's a website that you can visit. As Dr. Saideloff said, this is an engineering award. I want to make clear right up front that I'm not an engineer. I'm actually a speech-language pathologist who still sees patients in the clinic 2 mornings a week. But I've had the great fortune of working with a bunch of really good engineers and scientists who have engineering backgrounds. Starting with Ken Stevens back in 1980 when I was a green PhD and coming to Boston. He took me under his wing, and then I've worked with a lot of really good people. Some of them I'm sure you recognize and are here today. And I want to say a special note of thanks to Dariush Mehta. He has been really pushing the technology development that our group has been undertaking for the past decade, really. And so without him, a lot of what I'm going to say today would not be possible. So because this is an engineering award, I felt compelled to talk a little bit about technical development. We started back in actually the late last century, end of the last century. It seems funny to say that. But developing something we call the Portable Vocal Accumulator. And this was a dedicated platform with a microprocessor in it. And I think we were the first to suggest using an accelerometer for ambulatory monitoring. And so the accelerometer has the advantages that Hamza has already talked about in terms of confidentiality, being immune to environmental noise. It's an easy signal to process, and we actually did a study at one point where we showed it was easier to track disordered voices with the signal. It had limitations. You could only record for a day, and because of the memory that was available at the time, we had to do onboard processing and just saving the frame-based data. We weren't really recording the signal that we could use for post-processing later. This then became a commercial device that Kate Pentax bought the licensing for that was available starting in 2006. This had all the same advantages. One disadvantage is they made it larger, and it became quite expensive. More of these actually sold in Europe than in the States because of the bigger interest in voice as an occupational feature. One of the things that did come out of this was a really good user interface, a way of displaying the data for the whole day, zeroing in, getting measures across whatever time period you wanted, including vocal doses, which is a concept that Ingo Tietze introduced. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, and we moved to using a smartphone as the data collection platform. And this included, being able to write app software. We still were using a accelerometer that plugged into the phone as the phonation sensor, and we've continued to do that. We also paired it with a smartwatch and did onboard processing of the data to be able to provide feedback to patients who were wearing it to help reinforce what was being done in voice therapy out in the world. It's sort of like the voice therapist following the patient around. This had the advantage, because of the smartphone memory, of being able to record actually the raw acceleration signal for up to 7 days. As I mentioned, we also did post-processing to be able to provide biofeedback. And now, currently, we're about ready to introduce this device into our research program. We've gotten rid of the wire, which was the biggest problem with the devices in the past. The wire kept breaking, and you know, it was hard for people to you know, manipulate everyday life with this wire connected to their phone. So now we have a neck band that connects to the phone using Bluetooth, and the neck band also has a microphone built into it. We're simply using that as a sound level meter. We're not recording speech. We still want this to maintain confidentiality. But this allows us to more accurately measure some features that we're interested in terms of sound pressure level, like vocal efficiency. In the past, we've calibrated the accelerometer against the microphone signal, but that's a noisy calibration, and so this gives us much better accuracy. The data from the smartphone is uploaded to a cloud server, so we no longer have to wait a whole week for the patient to bring the phone back in. We can check in with them on a daily basis, and this also provides the opportunity for ultimately a clinician to be able to adjust the biofeedback parameters while the patient's in the field in between, you know, weekly clinic visits. So this transfer of data happens whenever the phone connects to a wireless network. And then on the back end of this, like everybody these days, we're going to be using AI and machine learning to improve the performance of the system, but also to give us better insights into the studies of the patients that we're doing. So this is going to be introduced. In fact, we have a weekly meeting with the company that's building it. We hope like within the next couple of weeks. And using a smartphone also lets you provide, you know, create app software. And the other thing we can do with the smartphone is query the patient or the subject as to how they're doing. You know, how much vocal fatigue are they experiencing, what kind of vocal effort, discomfort, and so forth, and then correlate those measures with the objective measures that we're getting. And we've done a number of studies where we've done that. So in terms of convincing you for the need for ambulatory monitoring, it's clear that a lot of the common voice disorders that we deal with are due to faulty daily vocal behaviors or patterns of voice use. And these are difficult to assess in the clinic. We really feel like you have to, you know, monitor what people are doing in real life to understand what they're doing. We've shown in past studies that people are not good at estimating their own voice use. You know, we've done some simple studies like monitoring people and then having them every hour or so tell us how much they used their voice the hour before. And on average, people are off by about 100%. So we're not that accurate at estimating our own voice use. We just talk, right? And depending on what measure you're interested in, you have to monitor for a long time to get the estimated error down to a certain level. And you know, if you're interested in fundamental frequency, sound pressure level, you know, an hour or so. If you're interested in some of the vocal dose measures, you may need to get them up to 40 hours of monitoring to get the error down to a certain level. So that's one aspect. The other aspect we discovered is not just, I mean, you know, you can't just monitor people for 40 hours over 2 days. You actually have to sample the behavior over, we think, a minimum of 5 days to really capture the pattern of voice use. And this is being demonstrated here. This is showing the average accuracy of a measure I'm going to talk about, this daily phonotrauma index that we've developed. And for that to differentiate patients with pathology versus matched controls, you need about, to maximize the accuracy of that discrimination, you need about 5 days worth of data to do that. So in terms of the role of ambulatory monitoring in the clinical management of voice disorders, we think that we could improve prevention by identifying individuals early on who are developing a voice use-related disorder. You can imagine monitoring new teachers, for example, to prevent them from getting into trouble. Diagnosis, you know, if you can quantify the actual damaging patterns of voice use, you can address them more directly rather than sort of globally. A treatment platform, I mentioned ambulatory monitoring. This is something we're very interested in and are actually studying pretty heavily right now in terms of being able to facilitate the carryover of what's being worked on in the clinic, which is the most, you know, challenging part of any behavioral therapy. And then finally, treatment effectiveness. You know, has the patient really adopted in their daily life what you've been working on in therapy? And, you know, one of the ways to measure that would be to monitor what they're doing in their daily life. So the standard measures, and this HAMSA has mentioned a lot of this already. You know, we're measuring the sound pressure level. In the past, this has been based on calibrating the accelerometer. Going forward, we're going to be measuring it directly. Fundamental frequency, these vocal doses that people have talked about, and obviously also keeping track of the time that people aren't phonating, which we're beginning to develop measures to more accurately represent the recovery time, which is an important feature that hasn't really been included in some of these studies that have used ambulatory monitoring. So now I'm going to spend the balance of the time just sort of demonstrating how we've used this technology so far to specifically study phonotraumatic vocal hyperfunction. And we know that, you know, this is a common disorder that's believed to be caused by faulty voice use, and, you know, the most common manifestations are nodules and polyps. These lesions are assumed to be associated with damaging patterns of voice use in daily life, which cannot be accurately assessed in the clinic, we don't believe. Our early studies of ambulatory monitoring failed to find differences between people with pathology and normals if we were simply looking at sort of traditional average measures. And, you know, we were sort of kind of disappointed, but then we've gone further and are much more enthusiastic again. So what I'm going to do is briefly review 3 studies that HAMSA actually already alluded to, where we're using this technology. So the first study used 90 patients with phonotraumatic lesions, and as HAMSA described, we always match them with controls based on age, sex, and occupation. Each was monitored for 7 days, and we identified previously untested measures that showed a significant difference between patients and controls. And these were primarily distributional characteristics, which HAMSA has already mentioned. We used stepwise linear regression to identify the best combination of measures that would differentiate patients and controls. And then the final model, as he's also mentioned, was comprised of skewing of the SPL distribution and the standard deviation of H1, H2. We did a training set of 45, got an accuracy of 78%, and on the test set, we got an accuracy of 76%. And the figure is simply showing the plot of the decision criteria, which is the horizontal line. The patients are the dark circles, the controls are the light circles, and you're looking at this H1, H2 standard deviation versus SPL skew. This is all published stuff. Johan was asking about the physiologic significance of these findings, and this is showing an example of one patient and one match control in terms of the distributional characteristics of SPL and H1, H2. The patient is the dotted line in both cases, and you can see there's this skewing higher to a higher SPL level for the patient, and a narrower, which is characterized by a smaller standard deviation of the distribution for H1, H2, which is centered more at a lower value. As HAMSA mentioned, previous studies have shown that this H1, H2 measure reflects the abruptness or completeness of glottal closure. And SPL, because of the way we're measuring it in these studies, it's based on the amplitude of the skin vibration, of the skin acceleration. And in general, this reflects phonatory forces. So the larger the amplitude, the higher the phonatory forces. Now we use this amplitude measure directly without correlating with SPL. So we feel that, you know, these two measures together are reflecting, you know, the pathophysiology of what's going on. And as HAMSA mentioned, you know, in one case, the H1, H2 seems more sensitive to the presence of the pathology itself, and the skewing of the SPL seems more behavioral. You know, people are just using their voices louder, not on average, but you know, in terms of how much time they spend at these louder levels. So in general, let me orient you to this figure. I'm trying to do this. This should be okay. So there's a lot going on here. This is showing the difference between post-surgical measures and pre-surgical measures in this DPI, which I just talked about, the Daily Phonotrauma Index. The horizontal line is the decision criteria. Up above the line is pathologic, below the line is normal. The horizontal line represents no change, and so if dots are occurring on this line, that means there's no change pre-post treatment. The arrows represent what's happening post-therapy. So we had 27 patients who were monitored before and after laryngeal surgery to remove nodules. 13 of these patients were also monitored after post-surgical therapy, and those are the arrows. To generalize, I want to spend more time on talking about a clinical interpretation of the subgroups that I see here to sort of demonstrate how we think this might work clinically. So overall, in terms of the group-based statistics, the DPI did decrease after surgery significantly, but it was still significantly different from the normal control group. It only became non-significantly different after therapy, so this is like score 1 from speech pathology, right? Now, for the therapy-only group, so we had, you know, one group that got surgery and therapy. We had a group that had therapy only. There were 52 patients with nodules who were monitored before and after therapy. And again, overall, there was a decrease in DPI for the group after therapy, but it never became significantly, or it always stayed significantly different than normal. Right? So, and this, you know, from a speech pathology point of view, just kind of makes sense, right? You get these folks functioning better. You know, many of them still have pathology present. Nodules don't necessarily go away, and so this all kind of makes sense. Just to show you that subjectively, so these, when I say they completed treatment, you know, therapy, the patient and the clinician both agreed that they were doing better. You know, good enough to go off into the world on their own without any more therapy. And this is just showing you the subjective measures that reinforce this. So the voice-related quality of life, you know, the higher the score, the better. The KV, which is an auditory perceptual scale, the lower the score, the better, right? And you can see the numbers are going in the right directions in both cases. Bigger changes in the surgery group than in the therapy-only group, but, you know, improving as groups, right? So that, you know, these were considered successful therapies. So now I want to, I don't know, fantasize a little about how we might interpret this clinically in terms of what's going on with the subgroups of the patients. And again, to reemphasize, these are based on week-long monitoring, right? This isn't the patient sitting in the clinic in front of you in the therapy and saying, I feel much better, and, you know, the clinician saying, well, you sound much better, let's stop doing therapy, right? And these were also considered successful. So the first thing I point out is there's this gray box that I didn't mention before, but this indicates subjects who were normal on the DPI measure before treatment. And what this means is, and these were primarily, we would consider mild early cases, maybe early cases of phonotrauma, right? And what it means is that the DPI in the form we were using here was not sensitive to early stage phonotrauma. And so what we've done, since we got this data with Hamsa's help, is to develop a new version of the DPI model, which he trained on mild cases. And we increased the accuracy in detecting these early cases from 59% to 73%. So this now becomes a more effective early warning system. Again, you can imagine hooking up, you know, teachers or early, you know, people early in vocal training and being able to detect earlier whether they're beginning to show signs of phonotrauma in their daily voice use. This means we need to tolerate a higher false positive rate, but for a screening device, that's typically acceptable. Now, in terms of the surgery and therapy group, the patients who normalized, post-surgery may have a lower priority for therapy. All of us have, most of us have pretty busy caseloads with wait lists, and you've got to decide sometimes who's going to get seen before somebody else. And so, you might argue that these guys are, they're showing a daily type of vocal behavior that's like normal, and they're at less risk for recurrence. You may ultimately want to do therapy with them, but if you've got a long wait list, they have a lower priority. Patients who did not normalize post-surgery have a higher potential for recurrence, we think, and they should be a higher priority for therapy. In the therapy alone group, that subgroup that normalized, we think, have a good prognosis. The ones that improved but did not normalize have a guarded prognosis. They may need continued therapy with more emphasis on carryover. Keep in mind, all these patients have completed therapy. So these guys may not be quite done yet when you actually look at what they're doing in daily life. And then finally, those that got worse, right? Something's not right. So here you need to consider alternative approaches, maybe a different therapy approach, reassess the patient's motivation for carryover. I mean, they seem successful when they're sitting in the clinic, but they're not behaving that way in the real world. Okay, the last thing I'll just mention is the other thing that we're trying to do with this data. Hyperfunction is such a broad diagnosis, even within the two types, phonotraumatic versus non-phonotraumatic. And so what we're trying to do, we believe there are probably subtypes or subgroups, and that if we could demonstrate this, we're basically talking about developing phenotypes, and phenotypes are a set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of its genotype with the environment. And we think that if this exists, if these subgroups can be identified, we think we can improve prevention by identifying specific risk factors for individuals, more target prevention strategies for individuals. Certainly differential diagnosis, detecting subtypes would help us determine which factors are associated with an individual's issue. And then certainly for treatment, subtyping would allow us to be more focused in terms of the treatments that we're using, the whole idea of precision medicine. So this is our initial attempt at this. It's very preliminary. We're looking at 146 females with phonotraumatic vocal hyperfunction, again, monitored for a week. All the daily voice use measures that we're looking at, including aerodynamic function, which I'll quickly show you how we do this, were extracted from the ambulatory reporting. So the usual stuff plus aerodynamic measures. And we use something called latent profile analysis to identify potentially homogeneous subgroups who share a common response pattern. We basically constructed two LPA models comprised of variables representing daily voice use and aerodynamic function. And we combined the results of the two models to construct some simple preliminary phenotypes. So the phenotypes were constructed of looking at whether the subgroup had high, typical, or low daily voice use, and whether the subgroup had expected or unexpected pathophysiology. Now, real quick, we've done a number of studies over the years in the lab, measuring the aerodynamics with a high response time pneumotachograph, which is shown here, measuring the intraoral pressure to estimate subglottal pressure, and doing inverse filtering of the flow signal to actually capture an estimate of what the flow looks like at the glottis. Sort of, I always say phonating without a head, right? Which we could say about some of our politicians these days, I guess. But from these signals, we can extract a bunch of measures that represent the lull, or I should say, phonatory physiology. So, you know, the peak of the flow, high AC flow, the duty cycle, MFDR, maximum fluid declination rate, which indicates how fast the flow is shutting down and also indicates the velocity of full closure. To make a long story short, when we do this, we see big differences. These are effect sizes between patients with phonotrauma and controls. And you know, all of these things are elevated. They're elevated if you correct for some pressure level, if you covary some pressure level. Turns out, based on the work of Matthias Zannertu, that he's shown using a vocal system model that we can actually extract comparable measures from the acceleration signal. And to do that, you have to individually calibrate the vocal system model, but this works pretty well. So all of the, that'll be my last slide, all of the initial phenotyping I'm going to show you, which includes pathophysiology or expected pathophysiology, has been extracted from the ambulatory data, not in the lab. So this is what it looks like so far. So we have we've preliminarily identified 3 phenotypes. Type 1 is much smaller and is actually a smaller subgroup than we would expect. These are the overtly heavy voice users. Now keep in mind that all of these, or most of the patients in this group are in high voice use occupations. So what we're basically saying is that among that group of high voice use occupations, these guys really stick out. They have 53% greater voice use than the other subtypes. So it's a clear subgroup that are, I don't know, maybe out and out vocal abusers, I'm not sure. Type 2, and they have expected pathophysiology. The pathophysiology I just talked about, they display that. So high voice use, expected pathophysiology. Type 2 encompasses the majority of the patient group in this phenotype, and this is, you know, expected voice use, or I should say more typical voice use for a group of high voice users, and expected pathophysiology. Type X, we are completely stumped. These guys don't, they have typical voice use, but they don't display the expected pathophysiology. So there must be something else going on with these guys that's contributing to, you know, what's causing their problem. And that's all I have for you. Thanks.